In this video, I'll show how to set up a selection tool for one or multiple units on your mobile device using Unity and Bolt Visual Scripting. Let's begin.
Shall we play a game?
Before you attempt this build, you really need to check out my previous video called How to Set Up Touch Controls for Android and iOS because it covers several bases that you're going to need for this video. Just click the card in the top right to go there now. Also, if you prefer a written blog post in this tutorial as opposed to a video format, I've posted a link to an online tutorial blog on my Patreon page and you're welcome to go check that out. If while you're there you'd like to join my private Discord server, as well as take part in online polls for future content, maybe get a shout out in one of my videos, gain early access to future content, and help support this channel, then feel free to drop some coins in the coffer on your way there. For this build, I used a couple of free assets, one called Hero Knight Pixel Art, which you can get from the Unity Asset Store. There will be a link in the description below. And I also went to craftpix.net, which they are not a sponsor, by the way. I am so small time, nobody even cares about me. But it's called Free Pixel Art Fantasy 2D Battlegrounds. I actually have a subscription with them, but I try to use free assets. This is actually the background that I use. Just go ahead and download that and import that into your game as well. I just want to make a quick note on this Hero Knight game object whenever you get this imported into your game. The sprite image itself, I actually changed on this. So going to Hero Knight Pixel Art Sprites and going to the Hero Knight game object, I actually turned the pixels to units per unit to 18, and that made it significantly bigger, which means I had to extend the box collider on that so that it actually is much bigger, that you'll see there. The other thing is that I completely deleted the Hero Knight sprite just by right-clicking and removing the component, and I also went into the animator and deleted every single one of the animator parameters as well as all of the animations, and I completely started over. I don't like somebody else building my controller for me. That's just personal preference. You don't have to do any of that. I just thought I would throw that in there because it might look a little different. But my Hero Knight game object is larger in the sprite size, the box collider is bigger, and it has a brand new animator with animation set up in it as well. You're also going to want to add a flow machine to your Hero Knight by selecting your unit, going down to the bottom of the inspector screen, hit add component, just add a flow machine, add a new flow macro to that, just call it Knight. Then you're going to give it a new variable, call it selected. It's going to be a Boolean, and just make sure that that value is deselected. To set up a background image, you just right click and go to 2D Sprite, and then you're going to drag in your background image, whichever one you chose, which I put into my sprites folder. You're just going to go to that new sprite and just drag it right over here and drop it, and then you may have to resize it, which as you see I have done right here in my background image. And then I just put that at a -1 on the default sorting layer for the sprite renderer. The next thing we're going to need is a good indicator for whenever our game objects are selected. Now, I actually have one that you are welcome to use. It looks just like this. The way that you can get this is go over to my Patreon page and you will find a link to this online tutorial that I did. So it's a blog post. Just scroll about halfway down. You should see the selection sprite object right here. Just hit download, right click and save that, and import that into your game. Once you get that into your game, you're going to right click your Hero Knight game object, go to 2D object and click sprite. You're going to then rename that childed object selected. And then for the sprite renderer here, you're just going to grab that selection sprite and just drag it in. And you can actually change the color to anything that you want, which is why it's white. You can now change it to the desired color of your choice. I suggest green. You can change the scale. You're going to want to, obviously, you're going to want to position that game object under your player's feet, so it looks something like that. You're going to want to set the order in layer to a -1 just to ensure it's behind your player. And the last thing that you're going to want to do is just uncheck the sprite render so that we can turn it on and off when we want to. The next thing you're going to want to do is we're going to want to create a selection manager game object. This will just manage all the selections in every scene. And so what you're going to do is go to right click, and then you're going to create an empty game object and just rename it selection manager. I'm going to show you the graph here in just a minute. You're going to give that a new component, give it a flow machine component, and just give it a new macro and call it selection manager. And then you're going to give it two new variables. One is called touch1, and that's going to be a vector3, and then another one is also vector3. Just name that one touch2. In order to be able to visualize where we touch on the screen, we're actually going to need a selected sprite area. And so the way we're going to do that is just right-click your selection manager and create another empty object. And then going to that, just right-click over here on the transform and hit reset. And then you're actually going to right-click and add another 2D sprite image underneath the selection area. So you have a selection manager, selection area, and a selector sprite. Let me go ahead and turn that on so it's a little easier to see. There we go. All right, so selector sprite image. And the way that we're going to make this work is just going to whatever folder that we're keeping our sprites in, just right-click and hit create, and then you're going to create a new sprite. And you can actually have a little bit of versatility here. You can make a diamond or a hexagon or a circle or a square, just whatever you want to use for a selection. Totally fine, whatever you use. I actually used a square, and what it does whenever you click that is it just gives you a 1x1 square that pretty much looks like that. It's not anything fancy, it's just a white image. And so what you're going to do on that selector sprite is you're just going to drag that square object in there, and then you can again choose the color of your choice. Just make sure you turn the alpha down to somewhere around 100 so that whenever you make a selection on the screen, you can actually see through it. The next thing you're going to do is just reset the transform on that and make it a 0.5 on the X and a 0.5 on the Y. That's going to slightly offset it so that when you drag it, it's actually going to look really quite nice. One thing I forgot to mention, on your selector sprite, you're going to need to give that a new tag of S Sprite for selector sprite. So if you don't have that, just go and hit add tag and add a new one in. And then for our selection area, we are actually going to give that the tag of selector. So go ahead and add a new tag and call it selector, and make sure that you assign both of those correctly. Once you get that selector sprite the way that you want it, you just need to uncheck this box right here, and then we're going to need to set up a macro that allows us to resize it according to where our fingers are. The way we're going to do that is just right-click and create a new flow macro, and we're going to name that multiple touch, and this is the macro that we're going to set up in that. Let me just briefly explain what this is doing. This is checking that more than one fingers are touching the screen by getting our touch count, and if it's greater than 1, then it's going to return a true value. If it's not true, then it's going to go out of the output, and there's a reason why. I'll show you in just a second. You probably recognize this pixels to units grouping. It's pretty much exactly identical as the last video, except here we're getting our first finger press, and here we're getting our second finger press, because that's the way lists works. They start at 0 instead of 1, so 0 is 1 and 1 is 2. And what it's doing is it's converting the pixels to units by looking at our camera wherever we're pressing on the screen. It's converting that screen to world point, and we're just getting the X and the Y because the camera is setting at a -10 on the Z. We don't want our game objects to disappear, and it's going to set our first finger touch to touch 1 and our second finger touch to touch 2. Once we get that made, we're going to go into our selection manager and we're going to make the following macro. This is kind of the overview of it. I'll go through this piece by piece. What we need is that multiple touch super unit that we just made. We're going to run an input into that. Whenever we're getting more than one finger press on the screen, remember I said we have a true and a false, so if 2 fingers aren't being pressed, we need something to happen. What we're doing with that is we're just turning that sprite renderer off on the selector sprite that we tagged SS Sprite. So you can call that whatever you want, just make sure those tags match. We're also going to need to set up a new scene variable. The way you can do that is just go right here to scene and just go ahead and hit the plus sign. So I have one called selected units, and you're just going to make an AOT list there. So just make that an AOT list, and now we can actually get that variable just by dragging it in right here, and you should be good to go on that. So what's going to happen is that whenever we are touching in multiple places, the first thing that we need to do is deselect all of our objects and clear our list. That way, whenever we want to reselect something else, we can do that. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to run a for each loop. Everything that is in that list, it's going to set the selected bool to off. So it's going to be false. The next thing it's going to do, whenever it's done completing that through the body, then it's going to clear that list, and then we can start selecting things. So we're going to set our sprite render enabled on our selector sprite, that green transparent square or circle or triangle or whatever you use there. It's going to set that as enabled because now our two fingers are touching the screen, and it's going to set the position and the scale according to these objects. So it's going to set the position to touch 1, where our first finger press is, and then for our selector, because remember we had a selector sprite and we had a selection area. Our selector here is what we actually need to resize, not our sprite, because our sprite, remember, is a little bit offset. That's why we did that. So what we're going to do is we're going to grab our selector game object, the thing that has the tag selector, and we're going to set the local scale. And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to do touch 1, touch 2 is going to be subtracted by touch 1. So we're setting our position to touch 1, and we're subtracting from 2 to 1, and that is going to set the local scale. You should see that when you test now that whenever you touch the screen, you actually see that. We're also going to need to make sure that whenever our fingers are lifted off the screen, that we're throwing out kind of like a net. It's called an overlap area all. We'll get to that in just a second. But we need to make sure that the touch phase has ended. A phase is just like the state. You have several different touch phases. You have, hey, it just began, a finger press began, it's moving, it's stationary, it's ended, or it's been canceled by something else. So if our first and second touch phase is equal to our to ended, in other words, it's lifted off the screen. If touch 1 or touch 2 have been lifted off the screen, then what we're going to do is we're going to select all in that area between point 1 and point 2, or touch 1 and touch 2. We do that by selecting an overlap area all, and we select set point A as touch 1 and point B as touch 2. From our layer mask, we just want to collect our player game objects. So you're going to, on your knight, I meant to mention that, you're going to select a tag, a player. That should be kind of like automatic for you now. You should know to do that. But you're going to set that to player mask. So we're going to catch all of our player game objects, or we can say all of our enemies, or whatever you want to do. And so what you're going to do is everything caught in that area, we're going to do a for each loop that every single thing caught in that area, all those items are now going to have their selected bools turned to true. Okay, we're almost done. We're just gonna have to set up a couple more things and we should be good to go. On our Hero Knight game object, we're going to need to create a new selected super unit that's actually going to sit underneath his macro. The way we're going to do that is we're just going to right click and create another bolt flow macro, and we're just going to name that selected, and this is what that needs to look like. It's going to have an input. There is no output on this. You've never run an output out of that. Basically what you're going to do is you're going to check whether his selected bool is true. If it is, then what you're going to do is you're going to get child of that unit of himself, which we had that set, if you remember, on your Hero Knight game object. The first child that it's looking for in index 0, that's number 1. So it's going to set it to enable. And also, if that is, if it's true that he's selected, it's going to check the selected units list that we have in our scene. It's going to check and see if he's in the list. If it is in the list, then it's not going to do anything. But if it's not in the list, then we're going to add that item. We're doing that so that we don't have a bunch of duplicates of the same game object. So when that is true, it's going to add itself. I know this is kind of hard to see. Let me give you a better picture on what those strings are going to here. Basically, your selected unit is running into contains item. It's going to run over here to add item in the list portion, and then it's going to run down here in the list portion as well. Then we're going to check for itself. We're going to add self, or if we're not selecting, then what we're going to do is we're going to turn our sprite renderer off, and then we're going to remove our self itself from the list. Once you get this fixed, you're going to go into your Hero Knight game object, and this is basically what you're going to do. You're just going to run an update into that selected super unit, and you should be good to go now. Okay, we should now have a good selector tool for our mobile games that allows us to pick between one or multiple objects. That way you can pick what you like and get rid of what you don't. I hope you enjoyed this video. Either way, my name is Megahertz, and I'm out.